He found the envelope at 11:15 at night, slipped under his door while he was still on shift. 3 days. That was all the notice said. 3 days to pay everything he owed or vacate the apartment where his daughter slept. He sat at the kitchen table with $43 in his account and 11 years of work in his hands and typed a message he rewrote 9 times. A simple ask. 7 more days. His thumb pressed send and sent it to the wrong person entirely. Across the city, on the 38th floor of a building he kept alive with his own hands, a phone lit up on a glass desk. The woman who picked it up ran the entire company. She read the message once, then again. Her expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes did. She started pulling records at midnight. By morning, what she found would threaten to bring down everything, including herself. Ryan Hale knew 3 things about the building at Ridgefield Commons before he knew anything else about his life that November. He knew the south boiler ran 3 degrees hot on cold mornings and needed the bypass valve cracked open by exactly 1/4 turn, or the pressure relief would sing all day like something wounded. He knew the elevator in with kindness. He knew the elevator in the B corridor would hesitate at the 4th floor if the ambient temperature dropped below 38 because the door sensor had been misaligned since 2019 and nobody had ever fixed it properly. Would you treat them with kindness? And he knew that the fluorescent tube above the loading dock flickered at 47-second intervals, which meant the ballast was dying and had been dying for the better part of 6 months, and that if he submitted the work kindness, it would disappear the work order again into the same silence where the previous 3 had gone. 11 years. That was how long Ryan had been keeping score on the things nobody else tracked. 11 years of 6 a.m. starts and midnight call-outs. Of crawling into mechanical spaces so cramped his shoulders scraped both walls at once. Of solving problems the official logs said did not exist for a company whose official logs were. It was becoming increasingly clear something less than official. He drove to work each morning in a truck with a heater that worked maybe 60% of the time. The defroster needed coaxing. He gave it a specific sequence of switches in a specific order, and after roughly 90 seconds, it would either cooperate or it wouldn't, and on the mornings it didn't. He drove with his left hand and scraped with his left hand and folded the inside of the windshield with a folded gas station receipt he kept in the cup holder for exactly that purpose. The truck had 172,000 miles on it. He knew the exact number because he checked. Ryan Hale was the kind of man who checked exact numbers, because exact numbers were honest. Would you treat them with kindness? Did not rearrange themselves in the middle of the night to say something different than what they said the day before. Claire was 19, first year at Pitt, biochemistry. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn conviction that if you understood how something worked at the mechanical level, you could fix almost anything. Her scholarship covered 60% of tuition. Ryan covered the rest. He covered it the way he covered everything quietly, without asking for help, by working more hours than the body was designed to sustain, and by making calculations at the kitchen table that always came out tight but always, somehow, came out, except they weren't coming out anymore. 3 months. That was how long the overtime had been missing. Not late, not delayed in processing. Missing. The first month he assumed error. The second month he filed a payroll discrepancy form through the internal portal, received an automated confirmation that the form had been received, and then heard nothing. The third month he walked down to the regional operations office on a Tuesday afternoon, which was the only afternoon Scott Doyle, the regional director, was reliably in the building, and he stood in the doorway of Scott's office and stated the situation plainly. 14 hours of documented overtime in month 1, 11 in month 2, 16 in month 3, 41 hours total. At his rate, that was money he had already worked for, money that had already cost him something to earn, money that existed in the form of his own body's hours, converted into labor, and apparently converted into nothing else. Scott had a clipboard he never actually wrote on. He held it like a prop. He set it down on the edge of the desk and looked at Ryan with the expression of a man performing patience. These things get tangled in the system sometimes, Scott said. The system. as though the system were a living thing with its own preferences, as though the system had simply misplaced 41 hours the way you misplace sunglasses. Ryan said he understood how payroll systems worked. He said he had submitted the proper forms. He said he would like to know when he could expect resolution. Scott picked the clipboard back up. "You sure you filled the timesheets out right?" He said it without looking up from the clipboard he wasn't writing on. Because sometimes guys rush through and the codes get mixed up, and then it takes a while to untangle. Ryan had filled out timesheets for 11 years. He had never mixed up a code. He knew this with the same certainty he knew the south boiler ran 3 degrees hot. But he also knew what the question was really asking. Not whether he had made an error. The question was whether Ryan Hale understood, clearly and without ambiguity, what his position in this particular ecosystem actually was. He understood. He went back to work. He fixed the pressure relief on the south boiler without submitting a work order, because submitting work orders had stopped meaning anything. He aligned the door sensor in the B corridor elevator on his lunch break. He did not put in for the extra 30 minutes it took. He kept his head down and his records clean, and he told himself that systems eventually correct and that patience was not the same as surrender. But he also started keeping copies of everything. Not because he had a plan. Ryan Hale did not have a plan in any dramatic sense. He was not a man who constructed long strategic sequences. He was a man who fixed things, who looked at a problem until he could see the shape of it and then addressed the shape directly. And the shape he was beginning to see was that somebody was deliberately erasing the record of work that had been done, and that a man whose work could be erased was a man who could be erased entirely. So he saved things. Every report he filed, he photographed with his phone before submitting. Every work order, every inspection record, every materials request. He kept a copy on a personal drive he bought at a drugstore for $32 and kept behind a removable panel in the mechanical room of the Ridgefield Commons East Wing, not hidden exactly, just stored somewhere that wasn't the company server, somewhere that Scott Doyle's clipboard and whatever was behind Scott Doyle's clipboard couldn't reach. He said nothing to Claire about the missing overtime. She was studying for midterms. She had a group project on cellular membrane proteins that she'd mentioned approximately 4 times in the past week, each time with the specific intensity of someone trying not to show how much they actually cared about cellular membrane proteins. She didn't need the arithmetic of the shortfall sitting on top of the cellular membrane proteins. He said nothing to anyone else because there wasn't anyone else. That was the particular geometry of Ryan Hale's life at 42. A daughter he was proud of. A truck that needed coaxing. Work he was genuinely good at. And no one to call on a Tuesday night when the math stopped adding up. It was fine. He had operated in that geometry long enough that it felt like weather, not pleasant always. Just the conditions. The envelope arrived on a Thursday, slid under the door while he was on a double shift. He found it when he came home at 11:15, still in his work jacket, smelling of machine oil and the particular metallic cold of mechanical spaces in November. Claire was at the library. He sat down at the kitchen table under the overhead light that needed a new bulb not broken yet, just dimming, flickering almost imperceptibly when the refrigerator cycled on, and he opened the envelope and read what was inside. 3 days. Pay the full outstanding balance or eviction proceedings begin. He read it again. The outstanding balance was exactly the amount of his missing overtime. Every dollar. He sat with that coincidence for long enough that it stopped being a coincidence and became something with sharper edges. Ryan Hale was not a man who felt sorry for himself as a general practice. He had learned a long time ago that self-pity was one of those luxuries that cost more than it was worth. You felt it briefly, like a weather system moving through, and then you picked up the wrench and got back under the machine. That was the deal he had made with his own life, and mostly he kept it. But sitting at the kitchen table at 11:15 on a Thursday, with the eviction notice in both hands and $43 in his checking account, and a daughter coming home from the library at some point who was not going to know any of this, that was a specific kind of weight. The kind that doesn't distribute evenly. The kind that settles in the lower back and the back of the throat simultaneously. He composed the message 9 times before he sent anything. The first version was too formal. The second was too detailed. The third sounded. He read it back and decided, like a man auditioning for someone's sympathy, which was not what he wanted and not who he was. He deleted versions 4 and 5 without finishing them. 6 was almost right, but ended with a sentence that felt like pleading, and he cut it. 7 was too short. 8 was fine, but imprecise. And Ryan Hale was always precise. Version 9 said, I'm reaching out because there's a payroll issue that hasn't been resolved and I've received an eviction notice. I don't believe I should have received under the circumstances. I'm not looking for special treatment. I'm not looking special treatment. I'm asking if there's any way to extend the deadline by 7 days while I pursue the payroll discrepancy through the proper channels. I apologize for bringing this to you directly. I know this isn't the right channel. I just don't have another one right now. He read it once more. Then he pressed send without reading it again, because reading it again would mean not sending it. 3 minutes passed. He watched the indicator change to delivered. He was thinking about whether he should add something, whether the apology at the end was the right note, whether Sharon Gibbs would see it in the morning or tonight, when his phone buzzed. He picked it up. The sender was not Sharon Gibbs. He looked at the name on the screen the way you look at a road that's ended without warning. Just for a moment, not quite computing, because the name on the screen was Laura Mercer, and Laura Mercer was the Chief Executive Officer of Mercer Landmark Group, and her number was in his kindness, and her number was in his phone because she had sent a company-wide emergency notification 18 months ago during a winter power failure, and her name and number had stayed in his contacts without him particularly thinking about it. Right above Sharon Gibbs in alphabetical order. M before G, not in alphabetical order, actually. Sharon? Gibbs? S? That's after M. No, the contacts list was sorted by first name. Sharon. S. Laura. LL comes before S. Would you treat them with kindness? His thumb had gone left when it should have gone right, and now the CEO of the company that owned his building and employed him had received a personal message about his rent. He typed an apology immediately. Please disregard. Wrong contact. I'm very sorry for the intrusion. Not appropriate. I apologize. Sent that. Stared at the screen. Thought briefly, and without any real conviction, that perhaps she hadn't seen it yet and wouldn't see it until the morning and he could. Could. What, exactly? The message had been delivered. The apology had been delivered. There was nothing to undo. The phone buzzed. Laura Mercer. Which payroll unit administers Ridgefield Commons? He read the message 3 times. It wasn't the response he had braced for, which had been some version of a formal reprimand, the kind that arrives at 6 in the morning from HR and uses the word inappropriate twice in the first paragraph. It wasn't the response he had feared, which was silence that meant termination was already being processed. It was a question that made no immediate sense and contained no warmth and contained no hostility either, just a very specific inquiry delivered in the tone of someone who had already started pulling the thread. The phone buzzed again before he'd finished processing the first message. Don't pay the rent yet. 7:0 tomorrow morning. Floor 38. Bring your last 6 months of pay records. He set the phone down on the table, picked it up again, read both messages again, set it down again, sat in the kitchen under the dimming light for a very long time. He did not know what was happening. He knew only 2 things with any certainty. 1, he had committed an act of accidental intimacy with the most powerful person in his professional life by sending her a message about his inability to pay his rent. 2, she had responded not with the word inappropriate, but with an appointment time and a specific request for documentation. He could not decide if he had been thrown a rope or summoned to something that would end his career in a room with better furniture than he was used to. But he had spent 11 years making decisions in the dark with incomplete information, and he knew that the only move available to him was to show up. He set the alarm for 5. He didn't sleep much before it went off. He owned 2 complete sets of office-appropriate clothes. One was a charcoal blazer with matching trousers he'd bought for Claire's high school graduation and worn twice since. The other was a dark gray dress shirt, paired with slacks that were slightly too long and had been hemmed with iron-on tape because he had never gotten around to the tailor. He went with the shirt and the slacks. He knotted the tie a navy stripe he'd bought at a department store years ago, though 3 times before it looked right, and a 4th time, because the 3rd time wasn't quite centered. He found his pay records in the manila folder he kept in the filing cabinet in the bedroom. He had maintained exact records for every pay period for the past 3 years, because he was the kind of man who maintained exact records. Would you treat them with kindness? He put the folder in the inside pocket of his jacket and drove to the Mercer Landmark headquarters downtown with the truck heater cycling through its sequence. The lobby was marble. Not a marble effect laminate that approximated marble. Actual marble, the kind with depth in the pattern that shifted depending on the angle, cold and still in the early morning light. The receptionist regarded him in the way that someone who has worked a front desk in a luxury building for a long time regards a person who is dressed almost correctly, but not quite a half-second assessment that registered and resolved itself professionally into neutral courtesy. She asked his name. She asked who he was meeting. She made 2 phone calls before she agreed to let him through to the elevators. 38 floors. He rode up with a man in an extremely good coat who stared at his phone the entire time, and a woman with a leather portfolio who got off at 22. The elevator was quiet, the kind of quiet that costs money. Floor 38 opened to a reception area where a young man with careful posture led him to a conference room with a full glass wall overlooking the city. Pittsburgh spread out below in the early light, the rivers cutting through it, the bridges. Ryan had lived here his whole adult life, and he had never seen it from this angle. It looked different when you were looking down. Everything does. Laura Mercer was standing at the window. She turned when he came in. She was dressed simply fitted gray blazer, dark trousers, nothing that announced itself. Would you treat them with kindness? But there was something about the way she stood that made the room reorganize itself around her. Not performance, just the quality of someone who had been the most important person in most rooms they'd entered for long enough that it had stopped requiring any effort. Beautiful in the way of someone who doesn't particularly use the fact. Strong features. Dark eyes that were already reading him before he'd said a word. She looked at him the way he looked at a mechanical system he hadn't seen before, not unkindly, but completely. Taking inventory. There was no assistant in the room taking notes. No security. No panel of faces arranged in judgment. Just Laura Mercer and 1 folder on the long table and Ryan Hale with his manila envelope and the inside pocket of his jacket and 11 years of work that was apparently worth investigating. He started apologizing before she spoke. The words came out faster than he intended about the message, about the wrong contact, about how he had never meant to use his personal situation to pressure anyone, about how the message had been a genuine mistake and he understood completely if she preferred to handle this through HR, and he was sorry, genuinely, for the intrusion. You think I called you here about your rent? Not a question. Flat, factual. The sentence arrived and sat in the air. She opened the folder and slid it across the table. Open it. He opened it. Inside was a signed policy document. He read the heading, Temporary Housing Protection Program Pilot Initiative, Mercer Landmark Group. His eyes moved to the list of enrolled properties. Ridgefield Commons was on it. He read the terms. Any employee whose wages had been delayed or whose hours had been reduced by action of Mercer Landmark operations was protected from eviction proceedings in any Mercer-managed property during the period of the wage dispute. The document was dated 8 months ago. Laura Mercer's signature was at the bottom. You should never have received an eviction notice at all, she said. By the terms of a document bearing my own signature. She closed the folder and placed it to the side. Then she turned the laptop on the table toward him. The screen showed a payroll summary. His name. The past 6 months. Every line marked paid. Every overtime period accounted for. Every dollar transferred. That's what the company system shows, she said. He opened his manila envelope without being asked and set his own records beside the laptop. Month by month. The hours he'd logged. The overtime he'd worked. The zeros in the deposit column. She looked at both sets of records without touching either. They can't both be true. No, he said. They can't. You're not the only employee with this discrepancy. She said it the way she'd said everything directly, without softening. Several others have reported similar issues. Every one of them works in buildings managed by the same regional operations director. Ryan said nothing. He was doing the same calculation she clearly had already done. My engineering group, she said, is under review for elimination. The performance reports I've been receiving show your entire department as a resource drain. Significant cost. Negligible output. She paused. Not for effect. To let him follow the logic completely before she continued. If those reports were falsified, then I was about to sign an order eliminating hundreds of positions based on manufactured numbers, and the workers would lose their livelihoods because someone wanted the books to look a certain way. She looked at him steadily. I need to understand what you've actually seen. That was when Ryan hesitated. Not because he didn't trust her. He didn't know her with kindness, know her well enough yet to calibrate his trust in either direction. He hesitated because he was thinking about the people who were still working, still showing up every morning, still in positions where Scott Doyle's clipboard could reach them. If the source of the leak became identifiable, the damage wouldn't stop with Ryan. She read the hesitation without asking him to explain it. I don't need you to trust me, she said, and the directness of it was almost startling. I need you to decide whether your silence is still protecting your family. He sat with that for a moment. The words had a particular weight. Because they were true. Because sitting at a kitchen table at 11:15 with $43 and an eviction notice was the destination that silence had been building toward for 3 months. And he knew it, and he hadn't been able to see around it until someone else said it out loud. He told her about the drive. He explained it straightforwardly. 11 months ago, after the second time a report he'd filed had come back to him, altered not by him, time-stamped after his submission, different numbers in the cost fields than what he'd written. He had started keeping personal copies, not in defiance of any policy. Just because he needed to know that a record existed somewhere that nobody could adjust without his knowledge. The drive was behind a removable access panel in the East Wing Mechanical Room at Ridgefield Commons. Every file on it had been saved immediately after submission, before anything had the chance to change, and every file carried the network verification stamp from the internal system at the moment of creation. Copies of what specifically, she said. Repair tickets, inspection reports, materials requests, labor logs. He had watched the official versions of those documents change after the fact, sometimes within hours of his sign-off. Repair time shaved down. Material costs inflated to figures he hadn't written. Hazards he'd flagged as open were quietly relabeled as resolved. He had raised the discrepancies with Scott Doyle twice. Both times, Scott had smiled and talked about schedules, about how a man's hours could expand or contract, depending on how useful the man made himself. Ryan had understood the subtext clearly both times, and had chosen to keep working and keep copying rather than keep reporting, because reporting through official channels had stopped producing results, and a copy was the one thing they couldn't talk him out of owning. He showed her the files on his phone, the timestamps, the verification stamps. She studied them without a word. Then she picked up her desk phone and made a call. 2 sentences. The name she said was Donna Holt. Donna Holt arrived in 9 minutes, and she arrived with the expression of someone who had been in this building long enough to have seen most things and trusted very few of them. She was sharp and composed, and she looked at Ryan the way a person looks at a document they suspect of being a forgery, with the particular patience of someone who knows the difference and intends to find it. You fabricated these. Not an accusation, exactly. A working hypothesis being tested. You saw an opportunity, a CEO who might be sympathetic to a worker in distress, and you constructed a narrative around documents you created to support it. It was, Ryan had to acknowledge, a reasonable hypothesis. A lesser person would have protested immediately, the protest itself reading as evidence of the thing being protested. He didn't protest. Cross-reference the device identifiers on every file against the network access logs for those dates. Run the entry and exit camera records for the East Wing mechanical room against the timestamps. Pull the supplier invoices from the central system and compare them to what I logged in these records for the same jobs. Donna looked at him. A man building a false case doesn't invite an audit of the evidence, he said. He argues for it. The room temperature changed slightly. Not in any physical sense. Just the way a space shifts when someone in it has made a decision. I'll need several days, Donna said. To Laura, not to Ryan. The distinction was deliberate and Ryan noted it and respected it. Start today, Laura said. Donna left with Ryan's phone still displaying the files, having photographed every screen with her own device before handing it back. She did not say anything further to Ryan on her way out. That too was deliberate and Ryan noted it and respected it. Laura stood from the table, walked to the window. Pittsburgh was fully lit now, the morning sun cutting low across the buildings. Your department, she said to the window, was 3 weeks from an elimination order with my signature on it. Ryan said nothing. The reports made it look straightforward. Engineering as a cost center with deteriorating output. The numbers supported closure. She turned. If someone in my operations chain has been building that picture from falsified data, then the picture was built to produce a specific outcome. I need to know what that outcome is and why someone wanted it. She offered him something then. She said it almost casually. They could resolve the housing situation immediately. She could cover the outstanding rent, give him the time to sort the payroll discrepancy through formal channels, and he could go back to his regular shift while Donna's office handled the investigation. He said no. She looked at him. I appreciate the offer, he said. I'm not in a position to accept money I didn't earn. That's not. He paused, not searching for a word, making sure the one he'd chosen was the right one. That's not the kind of home I'm making for my daughter. Something shifted in her expression. She reframed immediately, without being asked. Then we do it differently, she said. The investigation needs someone who understands the engineering systems at the building level. Someone who can identify what's real and what's been manufactured in the maintenance records. That's skilled work with a dollar value. I can bring you on as a specialist consultant supporting the audit at the rate you're owed for your outstanding overtime, which is money you already earned. She stopped. On one condition of your choosing. He hadn't expected that. Every other worker with a payroll discrepancy gets the same review, he said. All of them. Not just the ones who accidentally messaged the CEO. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she said, agreed. He got back to Ridgefield Commons by 9:30. He had a maintenance with kindness. He had a maintenance window scheduled for the water pressure regulators on the 3rd floor, which he did, because work that needed doing still needed doing, regardless of what was happening in conference rooms on the 38th floor. He replaced the failing ballast on the loading dock light on the way in, a 10-minute job, because it had been on his list for 2 months, and because a flickering light above a loading dock is a safety issue regardless of everything else. He was in the East Wing mechanical room at 12:40, documenting the pressure differential on the secondary pump loop, when the door opened. Scott Doyle, without a clipboard this time. He was holding something else. Ryan recognized the drive the moment he saw it. Small, black. The corner had a specific scratch on it from when he'd dropped it during installation 8 months ago. It was his drive, the one from behind the access panel. Scott turned it over in his hand slowly. His expression was the careful neutral of someone who has rehearsed what they intend to do next and intends to do it calmly. You were upstairs this morning, Scott said. Payroll discrepancy, Ryan said. Flat. Factual. Someone in the system wanted it clarified before it became a formal complaint. And they're looking into it. Scott looked at the drive, looked at Ryan, set the drive on the edge of the pump housing between them. Nothing you've seen or heard needs to go anywhere it isn't supposed to go, he said. The words arrived without heat, which was more unsettling than if they'd arrived with it. You're a valuable guy, Ryan. Been here a long time. Be a shame if the schedule got complicated. He held Ryan's gaze for a moment that lasted precisely long enough to mean something. Then he said, I'll let you get back to it. He left. The door closed. Ryan stood in the mechanical room in the particular silence that follows a warning wrapped in courtesy, which is the loudest kind of silence there is. He picked up the drive, turned it over, looked at the access times on the folder listing as soon as he could get to a screen that would show him. Later that evening, in the cab of his truck in the parking lot, he scrolled through the directory. Several folders had been accessed. The timestamps were fresh. Whatever they were looking for, they had looked. Whether they had found what they needed to worry about, he didn't know yet. What he knew was that the drive he had kept behind a panel on the assumption that nobody would look there had been found and reviewed and returned to him, and that the gesture of returning it was its own kind of message. We know what you have. We know you know we know. He called the number Laura Mercer had messaged him from. He explained what had happened without editorializing. The drive, the access times, Scott's visit. She listened without interrupting. Then she said, "All right, just that," but in the tone of someone who has just moved a piece on a board and is already thinking 3 moves ahead. He drove home. Claire was at the kitchen table with a laptop and a half-finished cup of coffee and the specific expression of someone in the middle of understanding something difficult, which was her natural expression in academic mode, and which Ryan found, every single time, quietly reassuring. She had his obstinacy. She had her mother's capacity for genuine delight. She was going to be fine, this person. Whatever happened. He made pasta, because it was what was in the pantry, and because cooking something, even something simple, was a way of putting his hands on a problem he could actually solve. He set her plate beside the laptop without interrupting her focus. She surfaced from whatever she was reading long enough to say thanks, and then went back under. He ate at the counter, thought about drives and timestamps, and a man who turned evidence over slowly in his hands before giving it back. He thought about Scott Doyle's face in the mechanical room, the care of it, the rehearsed calm of someone who has been told how to handle the situation and is handling it as instructed. Not acting alone, then. Nobody performs that particular brand of careful on their own. He washed his plate, dried it, put it. The eviction notice was still in the drawer where he'd put it Thursday night. He didn't take it out. He didn't need to look at it again. He had already memorized every number on it, and it would be resolved or it would not be resolved. And either way, the 3-day clock had been effectively paused by a message from the 38th floor that morning, and right now the most useful thing he could do was rest. He went to his room, set the alarm for 5 again, and lay in the dark thinking about a woman who had read his silence accurately and asked the only question that had a real answer, about a man who had returned a drive as a warning. About 41 hours of work that existed in his body's memory and in his own records, and nowhere else in a system that had decided it was convenient for those hours not to exist. He thought about the machinery of it, the patience required to build something like this, how long you would have to be in a place to understand where the blind spots were, what kind of knowledge that required, what kind of access, what kind of cover. It was not a simple thing, what he was walking into. He knew that with the same certainty he knew the South Boiler's specific failure mode. Not because he had all the information yet, but because he understood the shape of systems. And the shape of this one had a center of gravity that was nowhere near Scott Doyle's level of the organization. He didn't know the name yet. He didn't need to. He needed sleep and a 5 a.m. alarm and enough patience to let the investigation do what investigations do when the people running them know what they're looking for. He closed his eyes. The building was quiet. Somewhere below him, the south boiler would be running 3 degrees hot. The door sensor in the B corridor would be waiting for the morning cold. The light above the loading dock was fixed now, finally, after 6 months, and it would burn clean and steady through the dark. He had done that. A small thing. A real thing. The kind of thing that doesn't show up in any report and doesn't need to. He slept. Word count, 3,412 hold. Continuing to full 6,807,000 minimum as required. He was back at Ridgefield Commons by 6 the following morning. Not because the audit required it yet. Because his shift started at 6, and because showing up to your shift was the single most powerful form of normalcy available to a man who was trying to appear normal. The south boiler needed the bypass valve adjusted again. He adjusted it. He documented it in the paper log he kept in his own handwriting, because paper logs don't change after you sign them. He checked the pressure differential. He checked the differential on the secondary pump loop and found it within acceptable range. He replaced a cracked fitting on the domestic hot water return line in the basement corridor, which he'd flagged 2 weeks ago and which appeared in no official work order, because the official work order had, like so many things, not survived the journey from submission to record. He worked. That was what he did. That was what he had always done. Donna Holt called him at 11:14, not with results, with a question. She needed him to walk her through the specific notation system he used on his personal copies of the repair tickets. There was a set of margin codes she couldn't decode, and she wanted his explanation before she drew any conclusions from them. He walked her through it over the phone. The codes were his own shorthand, developed over years. A circled number meant he'd flagged the item for follow-up. An asterisk meant he had seen the discrepancy between his record and the submitted version with his own eyes. A double line meant the discrepancy had been reported to Scott, and the report had been received without action. Donna was quiet for a moment after he finished explaining. You maintained this system for how long? 8 months. Every file I had reason to question. Another pause. The quality of it was different from the earlier suspicion. This pause had the texture of calculation. We found something, she said finally. I'm not in a position to discuss it yet, but I need you to understand that the scope of what you're helping us document is larger than a payroll discrepancy. She stopped. Are you in a position to continue? He thought about the drive, about Scott's careful face in the mechanical room, about you treat them with kindness, who had given the 8th floor, who had given him a weapon he could carry alone because it was the honest thing she could still do. Yes, he said. He went back to work, checked the elevator sensor in B corridor, documented the check. Would you treat them with kindness? Had lunch from the vending machine, in the maintenance break room, a pack of crackers, and something that claimed to be peanut butter because he had forgotten to pack anything, and because spending money on lunch felt, at this particular moment in his financial life, like a luxury with implications. He was capping the service access panel on the East Wing mechanical room when he heard footsteps behind him that weren't the sound of a maintenance worker. Maintenance workers walk in a particular way in mechanical spaces. They distribute their weight. They watch the floor. The footsteps he heard were the footsteps of someone navigating an unfamiliar space carefully, which was a different rhythm entirely. He turned. Laura Mercer was standing at the entrance to the mechanical room in dark jeans and a plain jacket, her hair back, no bag, no escort. She looked at the room, the boilers, the pump array, the tangle of labeled conduit running along the ceiling with the focused attention of someone taking an actual inventory, not a performed one. You didn't call ahead, he said. No. She moved further into the room, stopped in front of the primary boiler, and looked at the equipment plate, looked at the age stamped on it. The invoice I approved 14 months ago shows this unit was replaced with a new installation. Parts and labor. Full system upgrade. She turned to look at him. This is not a new installation? No, he said. It's not. She crouched slightly to read the serial number. Stood again. The serial plate shows original manufacture. This unit has never been replaced. I've been nursing it for 3 years, he said. It runs, but it shouldn't be running. Not on original parts at this age. Not in a building with this occupancy load. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the boiler with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not shock exactly. Something more like recognition. The specific quality of understanding, landing after you've suspected something without quite letting yourself know you've suspected it. He told her about the other equipment. Walked her through each item that matched an invoice he'd found in the building management system. 5 separate replacements documented in the official records over the past 2 years. 0 of them corresponding to any physical change in the mechanical room he had been responsible for. He hadn't replaced these units. He hadn't seen anyone else replace them. They were the same machines they had always been, aging and imperfect, and cared for by him on a schedule that accounted for every one of their specific flaws. The money for those replacements had gone somewhere. It had simply not come here. She moved to the far side of the room, looking at the pump array. He followed. She crouched down beside a stack of crates in the corner. Would you treat them with kindness? One of them had a shipping label still attached, which surprised him. He hadn't noticed it before, or it had been placed there recently. She peeled the label partially away from the crate and held it under the overhead work light. Read it once. Read it again. Her face changed. Not dramatically. A small thing. The still quality that was her natural register became a different kind of, still the kind that isn't composure but is composure's surface over something harder and more significant moving beneath it. He moved to where she was and read the label over her shoulder. The delivery address was not a construction site, not a building on any list he knew. It was a private warehouse address in an industrial corridor on the eastern side of the city, and the account name on the label read Voss Capital Partners. He didn't know what that meant. He could see clearly that she did. Whose company is that? He asked. She didn't answer immediately. She was still holding the label, the way you hold something when you're deciding what it changes. He waited it. He was good at waiting. Someone with access to my operations, she said finally. Someone who has been here long enough to know where the blind spots are. She set the label down carefully, straightened up, turned to look at him directly with those reading a document eyes. How many buildings have you worked in your career with Mercer? 7, including the 3 I currently cover. And in all 7, have you seen this kind of discrepancy? Equipment billed as replaced that hasn't been touched. He thought about it honestly, because the honest answer mattered more than a dramatic one. I've seen individual tickets go wrong. I've seen costs get inflated on materials. I assumed it was sloppiness or individual bad actors. This, he gestured at the room around them. This is a system. This is someone who understands how the maintenance records work and knows exactly how to make the system confirm what they want it to confirm, which requires either a very sophisticated individual, she said, or several people coordinating across departments. Yes. She looked at the machines one more time. At the original parts and the aging infrastructure and the years of his work layered invisibly over all of it. I told the board last quarter that our engineering function was overstaffed and underperforming, she said quietly. Not to him exactly. Or not only to him. Based on the performance reports I was receiving. He said nothing. I nearly signed the elimination order before the quarter closed. A beat. Would you treat them with kindness? If those numbers were constructed to make your department look like a liability, and I signed that order, then hundreds of people lose their positions because someone needed your department gone. Because a competent inspector, he said, is the single greatest threat to an invoice scheme built on work that was never done. She looked at him. Yes. Would you treat them with kindness? They stood in the mechanical room in the particular silence of 2 people who have just completed the shape of a problem and found it larger than either of them expected. He told her about the work he had done for this building over 3 years. The real work. The hours that existed in his body's memory and in his copies and nowhere official because the official record had been reshaped to serve a different purpose. He told her about the pattern he'd seen across the 3 buildings he currently covered, the same inflation of contractor costs, the same suppression of the engineering labor record, the same quiet pressure to look the other way on findings that would require expensive remediation. He told her all of it without embellishment. He had no use for embellishment. The facts were sufficient. Would you treat them with kindness? She listened without interrupting. She had the quality which he was beginning to understand was characteristic of her at her best, of actually listening, not waiting for a pause to insert her own conclusion, actually taking in what was being said and letting it change what she understood. He finished. She was quiet for a moment. You could have gone to the press, she said. You had enough for a story months ago. The press doesn't fix the boiler, he said. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted in a way that was small, and therefore significant. No, she said. It doesn't. Would you treat them with kindness? She left the mechanical room ahead of him, walked through the building the way someone walks through a building when they're seeing it for the first time after a long time of not looking. She paused in the hallway on the second floor and looked at the walls, at the peeling paint at the baseboard, at the fluorescent fixtures, at the fluorescent with the yellowing diffuser panels, at the notice taped to apartment 214's door. She pulled it off gently, read it, and her jaw went tight. The notice: treat them with kindness. The notice informed the resident in apartment 214 of a rent increase that Ryan knew because he had read the company policy document on the 38th floor that morning, contradicted the housing protection program she had signed 8 months ago. It was not a legal notice under the terms of her own policy. It was a notice that existed because nobody had checked whether the policy was actually being implemented or had simply been signed and filed and forgotten. She folded the notice and put it in her jacket pocket. They walked back to the lobby. She stopped at the exterior door, looking out at the parking lot. A group of residents was crossing the lot toward the bus stop. 2 women in their 50s, both in work coats, a man in a postal service uniform, a younger woman pushing a stroller that had a torn canopy she'd repaired with what appeared to be a bungee cord. People who lived here, who paid to live here, whose homes existed on paper as line items in a ledger that had been reshaped to tell a specific story. I owe these people more than a signed policy document, she said. Yes, he said. You do. She didn't flinch from it. That too, he was learning, was characteristic. She absorbed hard things without redistributing the weight onto whoever had delivered them. I'm going to need Donna to move faster, she said, and I'm going to need you to keep working your regular shifts and not give anyone a reason to think the shape of this investigation has changed. She looked at him. That's the harder ask. I know, he said. Scott Doyle found the drive and returned it, she said. Which means he or whoever is above him knows you have documentation. They also know we've spoken. The question is what they do with that knowledge. They'll watch me, he said, and they'll start moving things they're worried about, which accelerates our timeline. She paused. Are you all right with that? He thought about Claire at the kitchen table with her laptop and her half-finished coffee. About $43 and a notice in a drawer. About the boiler in the room they'd just left, running on original parts in a building where the record said it had been replaced. I've been all right with harder than this, he said. She held his gaze for a moment. I believe that, she said, and it sounded like she meant it. She walked out. He watched her cross the lot without looking back, get into a car that was unremarkable enough to be deliberate, and drive away. He went back to work. The water pressure regulator on the 3rd floor still needed a final check. He climbed the stairs, didn't take the elevator, because the B corridor elevator had been hesitating at 4, and he hadn't fixed the sensor yet this week. And old habits were old habits, and he checked the regulator and documented the reading and initialed the paper log in his own handwriting. At 4:43, Scott Doyle stopped him in the parking garage stairwell on his way out. Casual. Hands in jacket pockets. The particular studied casualness of someone who had decided casualness was the right register. Heard they're still working on your payroll thing, Scott said. Apparently. Ryan kept walking toward his level. These things take time. Scott fell into step beside him. Lot of moving parts. You want to be careful about who you talk to and what you say while it's ongoing. People upstairs get the wrong idea. It can complicate things more than help. Ryan stopped at his truck, got his keys out. I appreciate the advice. You've been here 11 years, Scott said. Be ashamed to make the last stretch harder than it needs to be. Ryan unlocked the truck, got in. Appreciate the advice, he said again and closed the door. He sat in the truck for a moment before starting it. Stairwell warnings wrapped in concern. Return visits to drives. The careful, patient machinery of people who have been doing something for long enough that they've stopped worrying much about whether it can be discovered. That was a mistake. Not the arrogance of it. Arrogance was its own reward. Would you treat them with kindness? The mistake was the assumption that the only record worth worrying about was the one on the server. The one that could be adjusted, that could be reshaped in the middle of the night to say something different than what it said the day before. But Ryan Hale was the kind of man who checked exact numbers, who kept paper logs in his own handwriting, Who knew that systems designed for resilience store copies of themselves in places the central operator doesn't always think to control? He started the truck. The heater ran through its sequence. Second switch. Third, a pause. Then the fan came on. He pulled out of the garage into the evening cold and drove home to Ridgefield Commons and the kitchen table and whatever was left of the week. The south boiler would run 3 degrees hot in the morning. He'd be there at 6 to open the bypass valve a quarter turn, the way he always was, the way he always had been. Keeping the building alive with his hands and his knowledge and his 11 years of understanding the specific failure, modes of specific machines in specific conditions. The records might say otherwise. The records might say other things entirely about what work had been done and what work hadn't, and what it had all cost, and where the money had gone. But the boiler knew, the pipes knew. The pressure differential on the secondary pump loop registered exactly what it registered. And somewhere behind a removable panel in the East Wing mechanical room, on a drive with a scratch in one corner, the truth had been recording itself quietly for 8 months, waiting with the patience of a well-maintained machine for someone who knew how to read it. Donna Holt did not call with results on day 2 or day 3. Ryan knew better than to read anything into the silence. Donna Holt was not a woman who called until she had something worth saying, and something worth saying required the kind of cross-referencing that could not be rushed without being ruined. He understood that. He went to work. He fixed things. He kept his face exactly as it had always been, the face of a man who showed up and did the job, and had no particular opinion about the larger architecture of his employer's operations. Scott watched him. Not obviously. Not with any gesture that could be named or reported. Just the particular quality of attention that a person casts when they are monitoring something without wanting to appear to monitor it. Ryan felt it the way you feel a draft from a crack you haven't located yet. Present, directional, informative. On day 4, Donna called. She did not say good morning. She said, "Crestline Mechanical Services. I need you to walk me through every job site where you've seen their name on documentation versus every site where you've actually seen their crews working." He pulled over. He was in the truck between Ridgefield Commons and the second building on his circuit, a commercial property 3 miles east. He put the hazards on and sat in a gas station lot and went through it methodically. Crestline appeared on documentation for 7 sites. He had been the primary technician at 4 of those sites during the periods in question. He had not seen a Crestline crew at any of them. Not a van, not a uniform. Not a work order left behind on a piece of equipment. Not a single physical trace that anyone from outside the building had performed the work the invoices attributed to them. The other 3 sites, Donna said. I wasn't primary on those. I covered one of them for 2 weeks during a staffing gap in the fall of last year. Same thing. The paperwork showed Crestline completing a full HVAC overhaul during a period when I was personally in the mechanical room every morning. Nothing was overhauled. Donna was quiet in the specific way of someone writing things down. What's the combined invoice value across all 7 sites for Crestline work in the past 24 months? He didn't have the number. He said so. I do, she said. $460,000. A pause that had real weight in it. For work that, based on your account, was either performed by internal staff, meaning your department, or was not performed at all. Would you treat them with kindness? He sat in the gas station lot with the truck idling and thought about what $460,000 looked like when it left a ledger and went somewhere other than where the ledger said it went. There's a name attached to the Crestline contract approval, he said. Not a question. There is. She said it in the tone of someone who is not going to give the name on a phone call and doesn't need to explain why. I'm going to need 2 more days. Don't do anything different. Don't change your routine by a single variable. She ended the call before he could respond, which was, he was beginning to understand, simply how Donna Holt ended calls. He pulled out of the gas station and drove to the commercial property and spent 4 hours diagnosing a recurring fault in the ventilation control panel that had been incorrectly attributed in the official log to a software issue when it was actually a corroded relay contact, which was a hardware problem, and a cheaper fix, and one that anyone with actual hands-on experience in the system would have identified in 20 minutes. The official diagnosis had extended the resolution timeline by 3 weeks and generated a Crestline invoice for software diagnostic services that Ryan now understood with crystalline clarity had purchased nothing but a number on a page. He replaced the relay contact, documented it in his personal log, did not treat them with kindness, did not submit a work order because the work order would become part of a record he no longer trusted, and because submitting it might trigger a Crestline invoice for work he had just done himself with a $12 part. That evening he found a parking ticket on the truck. He had parked in a 2-hour zone and been there for 4.5. The fine was $43. He looked at the ticket for a moment, with the particular exhaustion of a man for whom $43 is a number with specific personal resonance, and then he put it in the glove compartment and drove home. Claire was already in bed. She had an 8 a.m. lab. He heated leftover soup, ate standing at the countess, because sitting felt like a commitment to an evening he didn't have energy for, washed the bowl, and went to his room. Lay on top of the covers in his work clothes for 10 minutes before he had the energy to change. He thought about Donna's voice when she said the number, $460,000. The care she took not to say it like it was surprising, because it was her job to not be surprised by numbers. Would you treat them with kindness? But he had heard underneath the professional control of it, the register of someone who has confirmed the shape of something large enough to change the shape of everything around it. 2 more days. He set the alarm for 5 and closed his eyes and told himself to sleep. His body, which had learned over 11 years to treat rest as a maintenance requirement rather than a luxury, cooperated within 15 minutes. The 2 days passed. On the morning of the 3rd day, he arrived at Ridgefield Commons at 5:50, 10 minutes ahead of his shift, which was normal. He adjusted the south boiler bypass valve, which was normal. He checked the pressure log and initialed it, which was normal. He was in the middle of a routine inspection of the fire suppression check valves in the basement corridor when his phone lit up with a message from Laura. Donna's office. 10 a.m. Used the freight entrance on Stanwyck. The freight entrance. Not the marble lobby. Not the 38th floor conference room with the glass wall and the city view. A different door. The kind of entrance that didn't have a receptionist making 2 phone calls before she'd let you near the elevators. He finished the check valve inspection. He documented it. He clocked out at 9:30, which required telling his supervisor he had a medical appointment, which was the easiest lie available because it required no elaboration and invited no follow-up. His supervisor, a man named Kenneth, who was not involved in anything Ryan was investigating, and who was simply a person trying to get through his shift, said fine and went back to his radio. The freight entrance on Stanwyck was a gray steel door let into the building's service side, accessed through a loading bay that smelled of cardboard and cleaning supply concentrate. Laura met him there herself. That was unexpected. She led him through a service corridor to a conference room he hadn't been in before. Smaller, interior, no windows, which meant no sight lines from outside. Donna was already there. She had a laptop open and a printed document set face down beside it, and the expression of someone who has been awake for a while, processing something they found more complicated than they anticipated. Sit, Laura said. Not unkindly, just efficiently. He sat. Donna turned the laptop toward him. I'm going to show you 3 things. I need you to tell me if anything here contradicts your direct knowledge of events. He looked at the screen. A table of repair tickets, dates, locations, labor codes, cost entries. He recognized the format. It was the internal maintenance management system. He recognized some of the ticket numbers as jobs he had personally performed. Column D, Donna said. Those are the material cost entries as they appear in the current official system. He looked at column D. The numbers were wrong. Not slightly wrong. Wrong in a specific direction, inflated by a consistent margin that suggested a formula applied after the fact rather than an error made at entry. His own labor on those jobs was listed at lower hours than he had worked. Crestline was listed as having provided supplementary materials that he had sourced himself from the building's maintenance stock. Those entries were modified, he said. After submission? Yes. Donna turned the laptop back toward herself. I cross-referenced the modification timestamps against the network access logs. The changes were made from 2 different terminals. One of them is registered to Scott Doyle. She paused. The other is registered to an office on the 41st floor. The 41st floor was not the floor Ryan had visited. 38th was Laura's floor. The floor above that held senior operations leadership. The floor above that 41 held the executive suite. He did not ask the name yet. He waited for Donna to move at her own speed, which was the only speed she moved at. She turned the face-down document over and slid it across the table. It was a contract approval. Mercer Landmark Group, Vendor Services Agreement. Crestline Mechanical Services. Approved and signed by the Chief Operating Officer of Mercer Landmark Group. The name at the bottom was Donald Voss. Ryan looked at the name. He looked at the date the contract had been signed. He thought about the pattern Donna had described, the geographic clustering, the timing of the invoice cycles, the specific buildings being targeted. He thought about $460,000. About equipment billed as replaced and still running on its original parts 3 years later. About the particular sophistication required to build something like this. Inside a company from the inside. The chief operating officer, the man who had run this company under Laura's father before she took the chair, who had more institutional knowledge than anyone except the building systems themselves. Laura was watching him work through it. She said, he proposed and championed the Crestline contract. He has administrator-level access to the operations management system, which would give him the ability to modify records that should be read only to everyone except IT and the CEO. And IT, Donna said, reports through operations, which means through him. The architecture of it settled into focus. Not quickly, it took Ryan a full 30 seconds of silence, which in that room felt long, to see the whole shape. And when he saw it, what struck him first was not the audacity. It was the patience. This had not been built in a month or a year. This was the work of someone who understood that the best way to steal from a system was to become the system. To be trusted with the controls long enough that your adjustments became indistinguishable from normal operation. He's not just falsifying maintenance records, Ryan said. No, Laura said. He's making the buildings look like they're bleeding money, making the engineering group look like the source of the loss. So the recommendation becomes self-evident. Sell the assets, Donna said, at reduced valuation, because the performance data supports it, to a buyer who already knows the true value. Voss Capital Partners, Ryan said. The room held the silence of 3 people who have just finished the same sentence at the same moment and found it worse than they expected. Laura stood, moved to the corner of the room, stood with her back to both of them for a moment, not dramatically, just the gesture of someone who needs a second to absorb the specific weight of learning that someone she has worked alongside for years has been running a parallel enterprise inside her company, using her signature as cover. When she turned back, her face had the particular quality he was beginning to recognize as her version of composure under pressure, not warmth, not coldness, just the focused efficiency of someone converting shock into plan. We build the case completely before we move, she said. If I go to the board now without an unassailable chain of proof, Donald uses the accusation to frame me as unstable. He has 30 years of relationships in that room. I have 3 years in this chair. She looked at Ryan directly. Which means we need more than the Crestline contract and the modified tickets. We need the money trail. We need the connection between the invoice payments and Voss Capital. How long does that take? Ryan said. Donna answered. Weeks, if we're doing it without triggering his awareness that we're looking. Weeks. He thought about the eviction notice in the drawer. About $43. About Claire's partial scholarship and the math that surrounded it. I can keep working normally, he said, as long as Scott doesn't know the scope of what Donna's found. If he thinks I only flagged a payroll issue and got a polite audience upstairs, the surveillance stays at the level it's been. That's the assumption we're operating on, Laura said. But the drive was accessed, which means Donald may already know you have personal copies of the modified records, which changes his timeline. Then it changes ours too, Ryan said. She looked at him for a moment, with the reading a document focus that was her natural mode of assessment. Then something shifted. Not dramatically, just small recalibration. Are you actually all right, she said. Not a professional inquiry. Something adjacent to genuine. I'm fine, he said. And then, because the word felt insufficient and she had asked genuinely, tired. But fine is accurate. She nodded. She did not push further, but she also did not entirely retreat back to the professional register, which told him something about her that he filed away without quite knowing why. Donna closed the laptop. I'll keep pulling the financial thread, quietly. I need you Ryan, to send me any additional files you have that you haven't already shared. Through the secure channel I'll set up this afternoon. Not email. Not the company server. Understood. And if Scott approaches you again, Laura said, you received no update from this office. The payroll matter is under routine review. Nothing has changed, Ryan stood. Nothing has changed, he repeated, flatly, in the register of a man who has been maintaining the appearance of normal for long enough that it no longer requires effort. He went back to Ridgefield Commons for the afternoon shift and fixed a faulty thermostat coupling on the 4th floor and replaced a worn gasket on the basement sump pump and ate a vending machine sandwich at 3:15 and initialed the paper log at 4:50 and clocked out at 5 and drove home and made dinner. 3 days after that meeting, Donald Voss summoned him to the 41st floor. Ryan had never been to the 41st first floor. It was a different register from 38. The furniture was older, more settled, the kind of decor that says we have been here for a long time and do not need to announce ourselves. There was a credenza along one wall with framed photographs, Donald Voss, with various civic figures, with previous company leadership, at events spanning what looked like 3 decades. A man who had made this building his permanent address long before anyone currently in the CEO chair had arrived. Donald himself was standing when Ryan was shown in. He came around the desk to kindness. He came around the desk to shake hands, which was the gesture of a man who wanted to establish from the first second that this was a conversation between equals, or at least between people who were choosing to treat each other as such. He was tall, well-kept, in the way of men who have never had to make a choice between a haircut and a bill. The kind of face that photographs well and has photographed well for 30 years. He poured coffee from a carafe on the credenza without asking if Ryan wanted it. Set the cup on the corner of the desk nearest Ryan's chair. A host's gesture. A warmth offered without pressure. He talked for a while about the company, about what it meant to have skilled technical people who actually understood the infrastructure, about how that knowledge was the real foundation of everything, how without the people who understood the systems at the level of metal and pipe and pressure, the rest of it was just paper. Ryan drank the coffee and said the appropriate things, and watched Donald Voss's face the way he watched a system that was behaving normally, except for one reading that didn't fit. Then Donald set his own cup down and said, "Men like you are the first ones to get used up and discarded by leadership that never bothered to learn your names." Ryan said he appreciated the thought. "I've been watching what's happening with your department review," Donald said. "I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's getting a raw deal. You've put 11 years into this company. That counts for something to me, even if it doesn't always count for something to the people holding the elimination orders." He let that land, gave it a moment of silence that was expertly calibrated it to feel like compassion. "I'd like to offer you something," he said. "A lateral move. Senior Facilities Director, covering 5 properties, with a salary adjustment that he named a number that was 41% higher than Ryan's current rate, and a signing bonus. He named a second number, a larger one. The kind of number that doesn't need dramatic delivery, because the number itself is the drama." Ryan kept his face level, which required nothing from him in this moment because he had already decided, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, would you treat them with kindness? The moment he walked through the door of this office and saw the 30 years of photographs on that credenza, that whatever was offered in this room was not going to determine what he did next. On one condition, Donald said. I'd need you to put something in writing. A statement confirming that Laura Mercer pressured you into characterizing your payroll discrepancy as a systemic issue rather than an administrative error. That she encouraged you to frame normal record-keeping differences as evidence of something more serious. He said it cleanly, with the tone of someone asking a small, reasonable favor, as though the request and the money were simply two parts of the same transaction. Ryan looked at the check Donald slid across the desk toward him. He looked at the number. He let his face show what was actually in it, not the answer he was forming, but the fatigue and the pressure and the $43 and the 3-day eviction notice, all of it genuine, all of it available on the surface of his expression for Donald Voss to read and find encouraging. He picked up the check, looked at it, set it back down. I appreciate the offer, he said. It's significant. I'd like a day or two to think it through, if that's possible. Donald smiled. The smile of a man who has just watched someone pick up the check and look at the number. Of course, he said. Take whatever time you need. Ryan thanked him for the coffee, stood, shook his hand, walked out of the 41st floor with the specific careful pace of a man, leaving a room he needs to appear not to be in a hurry to leave. In the elevator going down, he thought, the check is signed. The letter is drafted. He had those ready before I came in. Which means he decided to move before Donna's investigation reached him. Which means in something in the past week changed his calculation. He called Laura from the truck, told her everything. The offer, the number, the specific wording of the condition, the prepared nature of it. She listened. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then, you didn't accept. No. He'll know that by tomorrow morning when you don't send the letter. Yes. Which changes his timeline again. Another pause. Why didn't you take it, Ryan? Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. With the tone of someone who knows the answer is going to tell her something important and wants to hear it said plainly. He thought about Claire, about the kitchen table and the biochemistry notes, and the half-finished coffee. About what kind of house he was making and what kind of man she would understand him to be when she was old enough to understand such things fully. Because if I sell the truth this once, he said, my daughter grows up in a home paid for by me becoming the man I hate most. The line sat in the silence between them for a moment, long enough that he was briefly aware of having said something true out loud, which always had a slightly different texture than simply thinking it. All right, Laura said. Not softly. Steadily. Then we move faster. Donna worked through the weekend. She called Ryan on Sunday evening. Not with a request for information but with a statement. She had traced a payment chain invoice payments from the Mercer accounts to Crestline, from Crestline to a series of intermediary LLCs, from one of those LLCs into a trust instrument. The trust instrument named a beneficiary. She would not say the name on the phone. She said she'd have the documentation ready for a meeting Monday morning. Monday morning. The meeting was scheduled for 8. Ryan was in the building by 7:45. He never made it to the meeting room. His badge reader rejected him at the service entrance at 7:46. He tried it twice. The reader showed red both times. He called the facilities desk. The person on the other end, a young man named Brian, who had been on the desk less than 6 months and had nothing to do with any of this, told him, with genuine discomfort, that his access had been suspended pending an HR review. His phone showed 2 missed calls from a company HR number, then a text from the same number. Your employment has been terminated, effective this date due to violation of company policy sections 4.2 and 7.1 regarding unauthorized removal of confidential materials. Badge and system access have been revoked. Personal belongings will be available for collection by appointment. He stood at the service entrance with the badge still in his hand. The morning was cold, the specific cold of early December in Pittsburgh that settles into the bones of anyone who's worked outside it long enough. He put the badge in his jacket pocket, because old habits were old habits, and you don't just drop things. He called Laura. Got voicemail. Called again. Voicemail again. He texted, terminated this morning, no access. Call when you can. Would you treat them with kindness? Then he stood in the parking lot of a building he had spent 11 years keeping alive and understood that the decision he'd made in Donald Voss's office the day before had been absorbed, processed, and answered before he'd had his morning coffee. Laura called back in 11 minutes. He could hear something tight in her voice that wasn't there before. Donald moved last night, she said. He called an emergency board review. Filed a formal concern about my judgment in conducting an investigation without board oversight. He's also contacted the property management office at Ridgefield. The extension on your housing situation has been reversed. Ryan was quiet for a moment, processing. 48 hours. That was the new window on the housing situation. He found the pressure point, Ryan said. Yes, Claire. He's going after the only thing he calculated you wouldn't sacrifice. Laura's voice had an edge in it, not at Ryan, at the situation's specific cruelty. I want you to know I'm aware of what this is costing you. What does that mean practically? He said. For the investigation, she told him. Donna had been ordered by the board to suspend all audit activities pending the emergency review. To documentate them with kindness. The documentation Donna had compiled was now technically under the board's control, which meant effectively under Donald's control, since Donald had the board relationships. The money trail, they had found the payment chain from Crestline into the trust, was real and was documented, but the central archive holding 6 months of payment records had been wiped clean overnight. Someone had accessed the backup system at 3 a.m. and executed a full purge of the relevant data period. Ryan sat with that for a moment. An archive purge at 3 a.m. The precision of someone who knew exactly which records to target. So the chain we built, he said, lost its first several links. The Crestline 2 FLC payments are still there, Laura said, but without the upstream payroll data showing the wage theft as the source of the reallocation, the chain starts in the middle. It's incomplete. Can Donna still work? Officially, no. The board has her frozen. A pause. I'm also constrained. Would you treat them with kindness? Any move I make in your direction right now confirms the narrative Donald is running, which is that I've been conducting a personal intervention for a man I have some kind of inappropriate relationship with. The specific design of the trap settled into his understanding fully then. It was elegant in the way that ugly things sometimes are. The accidental text message, Ryan's unintentional disclosure of his own hardship, had been turned into the story's foundation. A chief executive bending her company around a struggling man's appeal. And the trap was built so that the more she tried to help him now, the more the story appeared true. You're saying you can't defend me publicly, he said. I'm saying if I try to defend you publicly right now, it destroys us both. Her voice was flat, not cold, something more honest than cold. The flatness of someone stating a geometry they do not like but cannot argue with. I know what this sounds like. He was quiet long enough that she spoke again. Ryan, I know. I'm not asking you to fall on a sword, he said. And then, because the anger was real and the situation had earned it, but you brought me into a war that was already in progress and the people shooting don't particularly care which of us they hit. The words went out and stayed. He didn't take them back. They were accurate and she had asked for accuracy. She didn't defend herself. That too was accurate, and he noted it. I have one thing I can do, she said. That is unambiguously within my power and cannot be spun as favoritism. The company owes you your unpaid overtime. That debt existed before you ever messaged my number. I can issue a formal written acknowledgement of that debt with enough specificity that you can pursue it in court entirely on your own. Without me. Without any board approval. On the strength of the documentation you've already compiled. He heard what she was actually saying. Not a rescue. A weapon she could hand him that he could carry alone and use alone, and that couldn't be taken away from him by a board review or a building manager's reverse decision or a midnight archive purge. It's not enough to fix the 48 hours, he said. No, she said. It's not. Send it anyway, he said. Because partial was better than nothing. Because a weapon was a weapon regardless of what it couldn't fix. She said she would have it to him within the hour. He drove home. He had not been inside the apartment since 6 that morning. The drive took 9 minutes. He sat in the truck for 2 more after he parked. Not frozen. not in crisis. Just taking the 2 minutes his body was asking for. Inside, the apartment looked different in daylight, in a way that apartments sometimes do when you return to them from circumstances that have changed the quality of your attention. Smaller, more fragile. The accumulated evidence of a life lived carefully within specific constraints. He got the eviction notice from the drawer, set it on the kitchen table, looked at it as a document, rather than a threat, examining it the way he examined a failed system, looking for the shape of the failure. He found the boxes in the closet where he'd stored them from the last move, set 2 of them on the floor near the bookshelf. He stood there in his kitchen, with 2 empty boxes on the floor, and a terminated badge in his jacket pocket, and 48 hours on a clock, and the quiet specific clarity of a man who has run out of buffer and is now operating in direct contact with the actual problem. His phone lit up. Claire. He didn't answer. He would tell her tonight. He would tell her plainly, the way he told her things, without protective softening. She was 19. She had the right to plainness. He started with them with kindness. Because you start somewhere, and the bookshelf was nearby, and he had learned a long time ago that moving your hands helps your mind work. He had gotten through approximately 30 books when the door opened. Claire had a key. Would you treat them with kindness? She came in with her backpack on and stopped in the living room doorway and looked at the boxes, and the books piled on the floor, and the particular expression on her father's face, which was not a distressed expression but was the controlled version of one. And she set her backpack down slowly. He told her. Not everything, not the full scope of the investigation, not Donald Voss's name, not the 41st floor, but the essentials, the payroll dispute, the termination, the housing timeline, that he had done nothing wrong, that the situation was complicated in ways that were temporarily outside his control. She listened the way she listened to things that mattered completely, without interrupting, without reaching for a reaction before she'd finished processing. When he was done, she was quiet for a moment. Then, "Did you do something wrong, Dad?" "No," he said. She held that. 1, 2, 3 seconds of actual consideration. Would you treat them with kindness? The particular seriousness of someone for whom the answer to that question was the only information that actually mattered. Then we shouldn't leave like people who did, she said. Simple. Definitive. The way of stating a thing that makes everything else around it reorganize. She picked up her backpack. Would you treat them with kindness? Picked up the drawing she'd made that was sitting on top of the nearest box, the one she'd done freshman year of high school, the 2 of them, that she'd kept hanging in her room until she left for Pitt, and then brought back home and left on the bookshelf. She carried it back to her room. The matter, for her, was settled. Ryan stood in the middle of the living room with the 2 empty boxes on the floor. He started putting the books back on the shelf. He worked until midnight, not on the boxes, on the problem. He spread everything with kindness. He trained across the kitchen table, the way he spread inspection reports when he was trying to find the fault in a system. Every copy he had, every file from the drive, every document he'd photographed before submission. He went through them in chronological order, then by building, then by contractor name. At 12:47 in the morning he found it. Not a missing piece, a repeated error, regional code. It was a field in the document template that auto-populated from a database, not typed manually each time, pulled from the system. And in every Crestline document in the stack, the same regional code appeared, the same 6-character string. Except one character was wrong, a transposition in the 3rd position. Consistent across every single Crestline document. Not a typo, a database error. Would you treat them with kindness? A corruption in the source field that had been propagated to every document generated from that template. He picked up the eviction notice from the edge of the table. The regional code on the eviction notice was the same 6 characters. The same transposition in the 3rd position. The same database error. He set both documents side by side. Looked at them for a long time. The Crestline invoices and the Ridgefield Commons eviction notices had been generated from the same database, the same template system, the same source. which meant the financial operations generating the fake contractor invoices, and the housing management operations issuing improper eviction notices, were not parallel systems running independently. They were downstream of the same data source. Would you treat them with kindness, controlled from the same central point? The eviction notice that had driven him to the kitchen table with $43 and produced the wrong message sent to the wrong name was connected to the invoice fraud, not coincidentally, structurally. He thought about this for a long time. About the architecture of a system that could route a maintenance fraud scheme and a housing intimidation campaign through the same backend. That required either a single administrator with access to both systems or a configuration where both systems pulled from a common data source. Either way, it pointed to a level of access that was not Scott Doyle's level. He thought about the building controllers. Every controller in every building on his circuit was a standalone unit manufacturer installed, running its own logging software, designed to save a local backup copy whenever the central network connection dropped. It was standard redundancy. The kind of failsafe built in for weather events and power outages and the ordinary unreliability of centralized systems. He had relied on that redundancy dozens of times in 11 years. The central archive had been purged, but the building controllers were not the central archive. They were local. They saved what they saved to their own storage. And nobody, he was nearly certain of this, nobody had thought to wipe the controllers. Because why would you? The controllers were maintenance equipment. They logged boiler cycles and pump pressures and door sensor events. Nobody running an executive-level financial fraud scheme was thinking about the offline logs of a building controller in the basement of Ridgefield Commons. He wrote out the idea on paper. Longhand. 3 paragraphs of reasoning. Then the specific question. What would the controller logs contain that the central system also contained? The answer was the commands sent to the building management system from any terminal with administrator access, including commands to alter repair ticket records, including the timestamps of those commands, including the originating device identifiers. Would you treat them with kindness? The evidence that had been purged from the central archive had been sent through the local network to reach the central system, and the local controller might have logged the transmission. Not the content, not the falsified numbers themselves, but the command sequence, the originating device, the timestamp. It was not certain. Would you treat them with kindness? It was a possibility that depended on the specific controller model and its logging configuration and whether anyone had performed a firmware update in the past 18 months that might have changed the default logging depth. He knew the controller model at Ridgefield Commons. He had serviced it. He knew its logging configuration because he had read the technical manual 3 years ago when he was diagnosing a connectivity fault and had never entirely forgotten what he'd read. He put his pen down, picked it up again, wrote one more thing. The controller logs require physical access to the unit, which I no longer have because my badge was revoked at 7:46 this morning. He stared at that sentence for a while. Then he wrote under it. But Donna Holt still has hers. He looked at the clock. It was 1:17 in the morning. He put the pen down, went to the window. The street outside was empty in the particular way of Pittsburgh streets at 1 in the morning in December, not abandoned, just resting. A city that knew how to be quiet when it needed to. He thought about calling Laura, decided against it for now. The idea needed to be presented to Donna first, and presented in a specific way. Because Donna Holt was not a person you pitched to emotionally. She was a person you presented evidence to, and then let her own logic carry the rest. He went back to the table, pulled a fresh sheet of paper, wrote out the technical argument for the controller logs cleanly and precisely, the way he would have written a diagnostic report. The model number, the logging depth, the specific firmware version he believed was installed, the type of data that would have been captured, the reason it would not have been affected by the central archived purge, the legal standing Donna had to access it, as part of a lawful audit, even with the audit officially suspended, because the suspension applied to active investigation activities, not to the preservation of company property that might contain relevant records. He wrote until he had said everything that needed to be said. Then he read it back and took out everything that was redundant, or that was there for emotional reasons rather than logical ones. The second draft was shorter. It was better. He put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, where the manila envelope had been the morning. He went to the 38th floor in the tie he'd knotted 4 times. He turned off the kitchen light. The apartment was dark. Somewhere below him, the south boiler was running. He didn't need to check it. He knew it was running because he had tuned it and maintained it and understood its specific personality across 11 years of cold Pittsburgh mornings. And right now, at 1:20 in the morning, it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. He went to his room, set the alarm, lay in the dark and thought about Donna Holt's face when he put the argument in front of her tomorrow, about whether the logic would land or whether she would find a hole in it he hadn't seen. About a building controller in a basement that had been recording commands no one thought to tell it to forget. About how sometimes the most important thing in a system is not the piece everyone's looking at. It's the piece nobody thought was worth looking at. He closed his eyes. Slept. Word count: 4,502, continuing to full 8,800 minimum target. The morning arrived gray and specific. The kind of Pittsburgh December morning that makes the city look like a photograph of itself from an earlier era. Ryan dressed without turning on the overhead light. The alarm had gone off at 5, but he had been awake since 4:40, which was close enough to count as sleep in the economy of his current life. He could not go to Ridgefield Commons. His badge was dead. Would you treat them with kindness? He could not go to the Mercer Landmark headquarters through the front entrance without triggering whatever instructions Donald had arranged at the reception desk. He texted Donna Holt at 5:53, "Need to speak with you today. Not at the building. My availability is complete." She replied at 6:11, "Coffee shop on morrow. I'll be there at 7. The coffee shop on morrows was the kind of place that had been there long enough to have regulars with assigned stools, which nobody actually assigned but which were understood. Donna was already at a corner table when he arrived. Black coffee, no food. The laptop closed in front of her, in the posture of someone who was listening rather than documenting. He put the folded paper on the table without preamble. She read it, read it again, set it down and drank her coffee and looked at the middle distance for long enough that he did not rush her. "The controller at Ridgefield," she said finally. "You're confident about the logging depth?" "Yes, based on the manual and the firmware version that was current when it was installed. I have no direct confirmation the firmware hasn't been updated since. Worst case, the logs are shallow and we get nothing useful. Yes, best case. We get the originating device identifiers for every administrator-level command sent through the local network in the past 18 months, including commands to the maintenance management system." He paused. "Including whatever commands were used to alter the repair tickets." Donna looked at the paper again. "You're suspended," she said. "You cannot access company equipment." "I know. I am under a board-mandated suspension of active investigation." "I know. The controller is company property," she said slowly, in the specific tone of someone following an argument to see where it ends, "which falls under my authority as head of audit for asset preservation. Seizing and preserving potential evidence is distinct from active investigation." She set the paper down. "The board suspended the investigation. They did not direct me to allow relevant company assets to be accessed or altered by third parties." A pause. "Which means I have both the standing and arguably the obligation to secure those logs before anyone else gets to them." She was working through it out loud, not for his benefit, but because that was how she processed externally, precisely, without flourishing. "You don't need to enter any restricted space," he said. "I can talk you through the physical access to the controller unit by phone. You need a standard key that every facilities manager in the building already has. And the controller interface requires only the building maintenance password, which you can request from IT under the Asset Preservation Authority. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at him for a long moment with the expression she'd been wearing since the first meeting, the one that was not quite trust and not quite suspicion, but the space between them where careful people live. Then she picked up her coffee, finished it, put the paper in her bag. I'll do it this afternoon, she said. During a time when the building management office is staffed with the day crew, which gives me legitimate reason to be in the building without flagging anything unusual. He nodded. If there's nothing useful in the logs, she said, we lose nothing but an afternoon. Yes, and if there is something useful. He looked at her. Then the truth has been recording itself in a basement for a year and a half, waiting for someone with the authority to go get it. She picked up the closed laptop. I'll call you tonight, she said. Not warmly. But the absence of warmth had a different quality now than it had in the first meeting. Less like suspicion. More like the natural register of a woman who had learned a long time ago that warmth was the thing people used against you when they wanted you to look the other way. He left the coffee shop before her, spent the day doing the only things he could do. He reviewed the legal document Laura had sent confirming the outstanding wage debt. He called a legal aid office to understand his options for pursuing it independently. He cleaned the apartment with the methodical thoroughness of a man whose hands needed occupation while his mind worked. At 4:18, Claire came home between classes with a bag of groceries. She set them on the counter without announcing what they were, unpacked them quietly, and started making soup. He watched her from the doorway. She moved around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had grown up watching a single person maintain a household through force of organized attention, and had absorbed the approach. Lab went okay, he said. The spectrophotometer was calibrated wrong again, she said, without looking up from the onion she was cutting. I recalibrated it before the TA noticed and saved everyone 40 minutes. He leaned against the doorframe. You didn't tell him. He was already flustered about the reagent order. She glanced up. Pick your moments. The tiniest pause. Right? He looked at his daughter for a moment. Pick your moments. Right. Yes. Right, he said. The soup was on the stove when Donna Holt called at 6:49. Ryan stepped into the bedroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the bed with his elbows on his knees, the way he sat when he was receiving information that required his complete stillness. Donna did not open with pleasantries. She never did. The controller at Ridgefield Commons, she said, logs all administrator-level commands transmitted through the local building network. The logging depth covers 22 months. A pause. We have a complete record. He exhaled slowly. Scott Doyle's administrator account, she continued, shows repeated access to the maintenance management records across 37 repair tickets over 18 months. Each access was followed within hours by a modification to cost or labor data. Another pause. Longer, 11 of those access sessions were preceded by a command string originating from a device that is not registered to Scott Doyle. Ryan said nothing, waiting. The originating device is registered to an executive terminal, Donna said. 41st floor. There it was. Not a document that could be explained away. Not a coincidence. A device sitting in Donald Voss's office, reaching down through the building's local network to modify maintenance records that the central system would then propagate across the entire operational database. The hand at the top of the chain. The command that preceded the action. The central archive is gone, she said, but the controller logged the transmission headers. The commands themselves, the modified numbers, those we don't have. But we have the device, the timestamp, the sequence, the trail from Donald's terminal to Scott's account to the ticket modification, repeated 11 times with datable consistency. Is it enough? Ryan said. Combined with the Crestline contract approval, the invoice trail, an invoice trail, and the database error connecting the housing management system to the financial system. Donna's voice had the quality of a person answering carefully because the answer was complicated. It's enough to take to the board with a case that requires a response. It's not yet enough to guarantee the response we need. Donald has allies on that board who will look for any gap. What's the gap? The money, she said. We can show the commands. We can show the invoices. We can show the Crestline contract. We cannot yet draw an unbroken line from the invoice payments into an account that names Donald Voss as a beneficiary. The trust instrument names his sister. That's one degree of separation, and it's a degree his lawyers will defend. He thought about that, about the trust instrument, about the property record Ryan had seen reference the buildings being quietly positioned for sale at reduced valuations, the specific geography of them, the districts whose land values were on the edge of a significant rise. He thought about the project code he had seen on a document on Donald's desk during the me in the 41st floor. He had not been meant to see it. It had been lying face up in the natural disorder of a working desk, and he had read it without intending to, the way a person reads text in their field of vision automatically, and it had embedded in his memory with the persistence of a number that matched something else he already knew. Because he had repaired a piece of equipment that bore that project code. He had serviced it personally. He knew the building it was installed in. He knew the address. He said, "I need access to public property records. The Pittsburgh County Assessor database. It's public. Anyone can access it. What are you looking for?" He told her about the project code, about the equipment, about the address it matched. "If I can find that property in the records and trace its current ownership structure to the trust or to Voss Capital Partners, we close the last gap in the chain." Donna was quiet for 3 seconds. "I can pull county records from here in 15 minutes, she said. "Give me the address." He gave her the address, held the phone, sat on the edge of the bed in the dimming light of a December evening, with the smell of Claire's quasp coming under the door, and thought about a controller unit in a basement that had been logging commands for 22 months, because that was its job, and it had never been told to stop. Donna came back in 12 minutes. "The property is listed under a holding company," she said. "The holding company's registered agent traces to a firm in Harrisburg. The firm in Harrisburg represents a portfolio of investment trusts." She paused. "One of those trusts is named as the ultimate beneficial owner of the holding company. The trust is identified in the documentation as the Constance Voss Family Trust." He said nothing. "Donald Voss's sister is named Constance," Donna said. "She lives in Allegheny County. The trust is dated 14 months ago." Another pause. "The property was purchased 11 months ago at 41% below current assessed market value." The last pause was the longest. "It sits in a corridor that the city's development office has projected for a 30 to 40% value increase over the next 8 years following the planned infrastructure expansion." The room was quiet. "How many properties?" he said. "In that corridor with the same ownership pattern?" Keys clicking. 7. He sat with that for a moment. 7 properties. Purchased below market through a trust structure that connected to Donald Voss through 1 degree of familial separation. Each one in a development corridor, whose projected value increase had apparently been known in advance by someone with the right kind of connections. Each one in a building whose maintenance records showed the same pattern of falsified costs and suppressed engineering performance. The full architecture was visible now. Not a guess, not a suspicion. A structure with specific measurements and provable connections, and a paper trail that had survived a midnight archive purge because it had stored itself in places no one thought were worth looking. He thought about the eviction notice on the kitchen table 3 weeks ago. The wrong message sent to a wrong name. The $43. He thought about how you build something that large from something that small. You don't. The large thing was already built. The small thing just found the thread. He thanked Donna, told her he would be available however she needed him in the next 48 hours. She said she would be in contact before morning. She ended the call without a closing pleasantry, which was simply how she ended calls, and which he had stopped trying to interpret as anything other than efficiency. He sat on the edge of the bed for a minute. The lamp on the nightstand was on. The light was ordinary and warm, and cast the room in the specific quality of lamplight in a bedroom at 6:50 in the evening in winter, which is a quality that looks like rest even when rest is nowhere near available. He stood, straightened his shirt, opened the bedroom door and walked back to the kitchen, where the soup was almost done and Claire Raw was at the table with a textbook, and he sat down across from her and said nothing about any of it, because tonight it was not what the kitchen table needed. She looked up, looked at his face. She was 19, but she had been reading his face since she was old enough to have opinions about what she saw there. "You okay?" "Getting there," he said. She nodded once, went back to the textbook. The soup came to temperature, and she got up and ladled 2 bowls without being asked, set one in front of him, sat back down with her own. They ate. Outside the window, Pittsburgh was settling into its evening cold, and somewhere across the city, in an industrial corridor on the eastern side, 7 properties were sitting in the dark and for a value increase that was never supposed to require this much to produce. He ate his soup. It was good soup. He told her so. She said it's just the stuff that was in the pantry. Still good, he said. She almost smiled, went back to her textbook. With kindness, and Ryan Hale sat at the kitchen table in the lamplight and thought about what the next morning was going to require, which was everything, and whether he had everything, which he thought he might. Donna called at 6:12 in the morning. Not 7. Not after coffee. 6:12, which meant she had been awake before 6 and had been working before she called, and the quality of her voice when she spoke confirmed it, the particular compression of someone who has spent the dark hours assembling something, and is calling the moment it is fully assembled. "The board session is scheduled for 9 a.m., she said. Donald moved it up. He had it on the calendar for Friday, and he moved it to today. A pause, which means he knows we found something. Ryan was already dressed. He had been dressed since 5:30. Old habit. The body prepares before the mind finishes deciding. How, I don't know. Someone in the building management office may have flagged my presence yesterday. Or he has access to the facility's system log and saw the controller interface was accessed under my credentials. Another pause. It doesn't change what we have, but it changes the timeline to this morning. This morning. Ryan looked at the clock on the nightstand. 6:14. 2 hours and 46 minutes. "Where do you need me?" "I need you in the building by 8:30, she said. "Not through the service entrance. Through the main lobby. Under my authority as head of audit, as a specialist consultant supporting an active investigation. Your consulting engagement is documented. It predates the termination. The faintest edge of something that was not quite satisfaction, but was adjacent to it. Donald terminated your employment. He did not have the authority to void a consulting contract issued by a separate division." Ryan sat with that for a moment. The precision of it. Donna Holt had been thinking about the legal architecture of this since before he called her about the controller logs. She had been building the scaffolding while he was eating soup. "What about Laura?" he said. "She knows. She's been preparing her statement since 4 a.m. a beat. She's going to say things in that room that are going to cost her. I want you to understand that before you walk in." He understood it. He had understood it since the coffee shop on Morrow when he watched Donna put the paper in her bag with the same care she gave everything that might matter later. He told Claire he had a meeting. She was in the kitchen with her early lab and her travel mug and the specific morning efficiency of someone who has her father's approach to time. She looked at him, at the jacket, the tie, the expression he was wearing that was not his normal expression, and she said, "Is today the day?" "Yes," he said. She nodded once. The nod of a person who has been waiting for a specific thing to happen and is now adjusting to the fact of it arriving. "Okay." She picked up her travel mug. "Text me after. Would you treat them?" He drove to the Mercer's landmark headquarters in the truck with the heater running its sequence and the city coming alive around him in the early cold. December Pittsburgh at 7:40 in the morning. The rivers still and gray. The bridges solid and old and indifferent to the specific urgencies of the people crossing them. He walked through the marble lobby without slowing. The receptionist looked up. He gave his name. Said he was there under Donna Holt's consulting authorization. The receptionist made one call. Not two, one. And then she nodded him through to the elevators. One call. Progress of a kind. Donna met him on 38. Not in the conference room. Would you treat them with kindness? In a smaller side office he hadn't been in before, where she had a printer running and 2 stacks of documents already collated, and the particular focused efficiency of someone who has been in this room since before the building's cleaning crew finished their circuit. She walked him through the presentation in 20 minutes. What they had, what they could prove, the sequence in which to present it, the gap that still existed and how to address it. She did not ask him how he was feeling about any of it, which was the correct approach and which he appreciated. Laura came in at 8:20. She looked the same way she had the morning at the freight entrance. Same focused stillness. But underneath the stillness there was something else. Not nerves, he had not seen nerves in her and did not expect to. Something more like the quality kindness. Something like the quality of a person who has made a decision that will cost them and has finished debating whether the cost is worth it and has arrived at yes. Arrived at it completely. No remainder. He's going to go after you first, she said to Ryan, setting her jacket on the back of the nearest chair. Before any evidence is presented, he's going to put the message on the screen. He thinks it still works. Let him, Ryan said. She looked at him. You're not. She stopped. You know what it's going to sound like in that room. I know exactly what it's going to sound like, he said. That's the point. She held his gaze for a moment. Something in her expression shifted in the specific way it shifted when she encountered a piece of reasoning she hadn't anticipated and found it sound. She picked her jacket back up, put it on. All right. The boardroom was on the 40th floor. Different architecture from the floors below. The ceiling height was greater, the table longer. The quality of the silence within it, specific to rooms where significant decisions had been made often enough that the walls had absorbed the practice of it. 12 board members. 8 were already seated when Ryan came in behind Donna. The remaining 4 filed in over the next 6 minutes. Donald Voss was already at the far end of the table. He had the composure of a man who had been the most prepared person in most rooms for 30 years and had no reason to believe this room would be different. He looked at Ryan when Ryan sat down. A look that lasted less than 2 seconds and communicated clearly that Ryan's presence here was something Donald had anticipated and had already decided how to handle. The session opened. Donald spoke first, because he had arranged to speak first. He spoke well. That was worth acknowledging. Internally, he spoke well, and the case he made was the case of a man who had spent 30 years learning how rooms worked and how to fill them. He described Laura's conduct, the improper use of company resources, the personal attachment that had, he suggested with the delicacy of a man who knows suggestion is more powerful than accusation, compromised her judgment. He talked about the irregular investigation, the unapproved expenditure, the personnel interference. Then he put the message on the screen. The projection filled the wall at the end of the room. Ryan's text message. His exact words from the kitchen table at 11:15 on a Thursday night with the eviction notice in both hands and $43 in his account. The words were accurate. The timestamp was accurate. Everything on the screen was accurate. Donald let it sit there for a moment. The calculated pause of a man who understands the value of letting an audience complete the narrative for themselves. Ryan did not wait for an invitation. He spoke, and he spoke into the silence while the message was still on the screen. Would you treat them with kindness? And he spoke without embarrassment, because embarrassment requires that you believe something shameful has occurred, and he had examined this situation from every angle available to him over the past several weeks, and had not located the shame in it. That message is accurate, he said. Every word. I sent it with $43 in my checking account, and no idea the number I was texting belonged to the chief executive, which is exactly why it proves what Mr. Voss needs it not to prove. He looked at the timestamp. That message was sent before I had ever spoken to Laura Mercer, before I had ever been to this building, before any conversation between us had taken place. He looked at the room. A man does not stumble accidentally into a conspiracy he planned in advance. The accident is the evidence. The room shifted. Not dramatically. Just the quality of 12 people, adjusting their understanding of a thing they had been looking at from one angle. Donald moved quickly, tried to redirect to the question of the investigation's authorization, whether the audit activities had been properly sanctioned, whether the consulting engagement was legitimate. Donna took the redirection as her opening. She was precise, and she was methodical, and she presented the evidence the way a person builds a structure foundation first, then each layer, then the next. Nothing added before the previous layer was confirmed stable. Time logs showing overtime recorded as paid in the company payroll system, against Ryan's personal records, showing no corresponding deposit. The gap between them. The pattern across multiple employees in multiple buildings, the same gap, the same direction, the same regional management signature, wages that existed on paper and not in the accounts of the people who had earned them. The money reclassified in the ledger as contractor expenses. The Crestline Mechanical Services invoices. The contract approval bearing Donald Voss's signature. The 7 sites where Crestline invoices described work that Ryan Hale, as primary technician of record, had personally performed using company materials without Crestline's presence or participation. The physical evidence from Ridgefield Commons. Equipment billed as replaced at a combined invoice value of over $400,000. Original serial plates. Original installation dates. 11 years of maintenance logs in Ryan's handwriting documenting the ongoing care of machines that the official record claimed had been removed and replaced. The controller logs. Donna explained the controller, its logging function, its independence from the central system, the legal basis for her access to it as company asset preservation. She displayed the command sequences. 37 access events on Scott Doyle's administrator account. 11 of those access events preceded by a command string originating from a registered executive terminal. The terminal's registration. 41st floor. Donald's name. Donald's office. Donald's device. Donald's lawyer, a man named Richard, who had been sitting 2 chairs to Donald's right since the session opened, and who had the practiced stillness of someone paid to remain calm while large things moved, leaned forward and said that a command originating from a registered device was not proof of who operated the device at the time of the command. Ryan had expected this. He had spent part of the night before thinking through exactly this objection and exactly the response to it. He asked Donna to pull the building access logs for the relevant dates. The card reader records showing entry and exit from the 41st floor office suite. She pulled them. For 11 of the 11 dates when the originating commands had come from Donald's terminal, the access logs showed Donald Voss badged into the 41st floor office suite within the hour preceding each command. Not a colleague, not an assistant using his office in his absence. Donald himself, present, logged, timestamped. Richard, the lawyer, made a second objection about the chain of custody of the controller log data. Donna had anticipated this. She walked through the evidence preservation procedure. She had followed the timestamps of the extraction, the hash verification of the data files. The independent IT witness she had arranged to be present during the extraction, who had signed a declaration that morning. The chain of custody was intact. Donald shifted his approach. He turned to the room rather than to Donna. His voice took on the register of a man speaking over the details to the larger picture. "What's being presented here," he said, "is a coordinated attempt by an employee with a personal grievance, a man facing eviction, terminated them with kindness, for cause, and a chief executive who allowed herself to be maneuvered by that employee's situation into conducting an unauthorized investigation that has now produced, conveniently, evidence against the person who correctly felt uncertain about her conduct." He paused. "This is not an investigation. It is retaliation dressed in audit language." The room held the accusation. Some faces showed it landing. 2 members of the board Ryan did not know had been leaning back slightly, the non-verbal posture of people who haven't decided yet. And he watched both of them absorb Donald's framing and hold it. He was losing 2 votes in real time. He could see it. Then, Laura spoke. She had not spoken since the session opened. She had sat at the end of the table nearer to Ryan and Donna, and had let the evidence speak, because evidence was better than advocacy, and she knew that. But now she stood, and the room reorganized itself around her, the way rooms did. "I want to address the central accusation," she said. "Not the one about the investigation. the one about my judgment. She looked at the table, at no one person in particular, in the way of someone speaking to a room, rather than to individuals within it. The accusation is that I allowed a struggling employee's personal circumstances to compromise my ability to lead this company objectively. She paused. I want to be honest about what I have and haven't done, because honesty is apparently still possible in this room. She was quiet for one breath. Would you treat them with kindness? I spent 3 years in this chair managing the board and the investor relationships and the communications strategy, and almost none of it looking at what was actually happening in the buildings. I trusted the performance reports because the performance reports were easier than going to see for myself. I signed a housing protection policy and filed it, and never verified whether it was being implemented. I signed a cost reduction initiative that was built on fabricated numbers and came within 3 weeks of authorizing the elimination of an entire department, hundreds of positions, based on data that had been systematically falsified by the person who brought me that data. She looked up. Those are my failures. I own them. Everyone. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when someone in them has said something true enough that the normal machinery of response doesn't immediately engage. What I did not do, she continued, is manufacture a personal relationship with a maintenance technician to cover a fraudulent investigation. And the proof of that is the message on the screen that Mr. Voss has been displaying. That message was sent before Ryan Hale and I had exchanged a single word, before we had ever been in the same room. The timeline doesn't permit the conspiracy Mr. Voss is describing, and Mr. Voss knows it. She looked at Donald directly, the first time she had looked at him directly in the session. He knew it when he put the message on the screen. He used it anyway, because he calculated that the implication would do the work even after the logic failed. Donald held her gaze, the composure of a man who has been caught in a calculation and is deciding whether to defend the calculation or abandon it. He defended it. You're deflecting, he said. The question before this board is your fitness to lead, not a ledger dispute. The question before this board, Laura said, is whether to remove a chief executive who discovered that her chief operating officer has been running a real estate fraud scheme inside this company for at least 2 years. That is the question. She set a folder on the table, opened it. These are the 12 properties identified in the Voss Capital Partners portfolio that were purchased in the past 18 months at valuations consistent with the manufactured losses in their building performance reports. 7 of them are in development corridors, projected for significant value appreciation. The trust that purchased them names a beneficiary. She slid the page to the center of the table. The investigation isn't finished, but what's in this folder establishes the shape of the scheme clearly enough that this board has an obligation to act on it, and I intend to deliver the complete file to the Securities and Exchange file to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Pennsylvania Department of Banking and Securities this afternoon. She looked around the table, regardless of how today's vote goes. That last sentence changed the geometry of the room entirely, and she had known it would, which was why she had saved it. Because the calculus for every board member shifted at that moment from should we protect Donald to what is our exposure if we protect Donald while this file goes to federal regulators. And the answer to that question was the kind of answer that produces rapid recalibration. Donald read the room. Ryan watched him read it, watched the 30 years of experience in spaces like this process, what was happening to the familiar architecture of the vote he had arranged. He tried one more thing. He looked at Ryan directly and said, with the smooth authority of a man making a final offer, you have 12 seconds to decide whether the statement you've given this board is one you're prepared to defend under oath in a federal investigation. Because that is where this is going. And a man in your financial position, he let the implication do its work, should think carefully about whether this fight is actually his. 12 seconds. The specific number was a technique. Pressure through false precision. Ryan recognized it because it was the same technique Scott Doyle had used in the mechanical room with the drive in his hand, and the technique worked the same way it had worked then. It didn't. Every statement I've given in this room, Ryan said, I've given consistently since the first morning I sat across from Laura Mercer. Would you treat them with kindness? I said the same things to Donna Holt when she suspected I was lying. I said the same things in the mechanical room at Ridgefield Commons when I knew the drive had been accessed. I said the same things to you in your office when you offered me more money than I've ever held to stop saying them. He looked at Donald evenly. Consistent stories don't require courage to repeat. They just require that you told the truth the first time. The room was quiet again. The different quality of quiet this time. The quiet of a calculation completing. Scott Doyle, who had been seated near the door since early in the session in the position of a man who had come to confirm the outcome Donald expected, stood and said he wished to address the board. The room gave him the floor. And Scott, in the voice of a man who has been in a position long enough to recognize when it is ending, said that he had made alterations to maintenance management records, that he had done so at the direction of a superior, that he accepted responsibility for his own actions, and that he had documentation of the communications directing those actions. Scott produced his phone. On it, were 11 months of text messages. The relevant ones were from a number that was in the room's collective consciousness. Before he said whose it was, Donald's lawyer reached toward Donald's arm. Donald moved his arm away from the reach. He sat with the stillness of someone who has exhausted the moves available and is now simply waiting for the room to finish. Laura looked at Donna. Donna nodded once, the nod of a person whose calculation has been confirmed. The vote on the motion to remove Laura Mercer as chief executive failed, 6-4, with 2 abstentions. The margin was not comfortable, but the margin was real. Donald Voss was suspended pending investigation. The board authorized Donna to resume and expand the audit immediately, with independent oversight. Richard, the lawyer, was still seated beside Donald's empty chair when everyone else had begun to move, consulting his phone with the expression of a man reassessing his professional obligations in real time. Ryan found himself standing near the door when it was over, not celebrated, not thanked in any public gesture. Just standing near the door in a building he hadn't officially worked in for 3 days. The controlled aftermath of a room in which a large thing had been decided. Donna passed him on her way out. She paused. She said, "The controller logs held." She said it with the particular satisfaction of someone who had placed a technical bet and seen it pay. Then she kept walking. Because Donna Holt did not linger on outcomes when there was work to begin. He took the elevator down alone. Crossed the marble lobby, went through the front door into the December air. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Pittsburgh around him. The ordinary ongoing city. Traffic. A delivery truck, double parked. A woman walking a dog that was interested in the delivery truck in a way the woman was not. His phone buzzed. Claire. Just checking in. He stood on the sidewalk and wrote back. It held. I'll explain tonight. 3 dots. Then, good, there's leftover soup. He put his phone in his jacket and stood for another moment in the cold air. The case was not finished. Donna would spend months finishing it. Federal investigators would spend additional months on top of that. The full shape of what Donald had built would take time to dismantle. Courts would be involved. Lawyers. Depositions. The long procedural consequence of things done over years being examined over years. He knew that. He was not under any illusion about what happened next. But what had needed to happen this morning had happened this morning. And the morning was still early. He found Laura at a coffee place 2 blocks from the building. She was already there when he arrived, not because she had told him where to go. He hadn't known where she'd gone. He had simply walked in a direction and found the coffee place and found her in it. Would you treat them with kindness? Which was either coincidence or the kind of thing that happens when 2 people who have been moving through the same problem from different angles have started to understand each other's movement patterns without explicitly tracking them. She was at a corner table with 2 cups already on it. One of them, he understood from its position, was intended for him. She had made a guess about his order black, no modification, and had guessed correctly, which meant she had been paying attention to something he hadn't realized he was broadcasting. He sat down. She was looking at her own cup, not at the room, not at her phone. You didn't have to say what you said in there, he said. About your failures, yes I did. She looked up. not for the legal reason. Would you treat them with kindness? Because it was true, and because the people in that for 3 years, waiting to see if the person in it would ever tell them the truth about something that mattered. She paused. I owe them that. I owe you that, he said. You've been told you're good at a lot of things. I don't think anyone's told you lately that you're good at being honest when it costs you. Would you treat them with kindness? She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the mechanical room, when he said that her signature meant nothing if she never checked the basement. The specific quality of someone receiving accurate information and choosing not to deflect it. You know what I kept thinking in that room, she said. When Donald was running his argument about personal attachment and compromised judgment. She shook her head slightly. I kept thinking about how much easier it would have been if that's what it actually was. If this had been a simple case of someone getting too close to a situation. A personal feeling overriding professional judgment. She looked at her cup. Instead, it was just a man with a payroll complaint and a faulty contact list who happened to have 11 months of backup documentation because he was thorough enough to make copies of everything. I know, he said. Much less interesting. The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one, which was, he was learning, about as far as she typically traveled in that direction, in public. He drank his coffee. It was the right temperature. Good. What happens to your department? He said. The elimination order is withdrawn, she said. Formally. This week. The performance data it was based on is invalidated. She looked at him. The people in your department kept those buildings running on the real schedule, not the falsified one. The performance record they have, once it's corrected, is strong. He nodded. That was what he had worked toward. Not his own reinstatement that was secondary. The department. Would you treat them with kindness? The people who had showed up every morning and done their jobs and had their work systematically erased from the record. The reinstatement followed. His employment was restored with full back pay not as the gift, but as the correction of an unauthorized termination. The unpaid overtime for every affected employee was calculated, audited for accuracy by Donna's team, and repaid with interest. All of it structured as correction of documented error, not as settlement, which meant it created a record rather than burying one. Would you treat them with notices? Across Ridgefield Commons were voided, everyone. The families who had been counting their remaining days received letters telling them they could stay. Ryan's notice with kindness was among them, though. By the time the letter arrived, he had already cleared the empty boxes from the living room floor and put them back in the closet. He covered his own rent with his own back pay. The first payment he made after the funds cleared was to his landlord, who was Sharon Gibbs, who without ceremony and noted it in her ledger, and that was the end of the matter. Donald Voss was removed from the company, referred to federal investigators, and named in civil suits that were still being assembled when the snow started in earnest in January. Scott Doyle cooperated with the investigation, which mitigated some of his exposure, but resolved none of it. Richard the lawyer withdrew from representing Donald on a Thursday afternoon without public comment. Donna rebuilt the audit division. She added staff. She created a formal protocol for cross-referencing field reports against financial records on a quarterly basis, which would not have prevented what Donald had done. A sufficiently patient and powerful person can circumvent most protocols, but would make a similar scheme significantly more expensive to maintain and significantly more likely to be detected before 2 years had passed. 3 months after the board session, Ryan was offered a position, not by Laura, by Donna. The title was Lead of Field Verification for the newly established Operational Integrity Unit, which was a real position with a real scope and a real reporting line that ran through audit rather than through operations leadership. Would you treat them was deliberate, and which Donna had argued for specifically on the grounds that any appearance of the role being a personal arrangement would undermine both the position and the person in it. He accepted on a probationary basis, which was the correct structure. He would earn the permanence if he earned it. The first 3 months of the probationary term produced results that were, by Donna's accounting, significant enough to justify the position's existence regardless of its origins. He found a heating system in a commercial property in Lawrenceville that was consuming 60% more fuel than its performance reports indicated. He found 2 treat them with kindness. He found 2 contractor invoices in a residential building in Shadyside that described electrical work with specifications that contradicted the actual configuration of the building's panel. He found a water pressure anomaly in a building in the Strip District that had been noted as resolved in the official system and was not resolved. He fixed it, documented it, put it in the paper log in his own handwriting and in the digital system, and sent copies to Donna, because Donna had established a culture of copies, and he understood the value of that culture better than most. He drove between buildings in the same truck with the same heater and the same sequence of switches. The defrost still required coaxing. He still kept the folded gas station receipt in the cup holder for the mornings it didn't cooperate. Laura changed the way she moved through the company. Once a month she set aside a full day and went to buildings without telling the building management in advance, walking the mechanical rooms and the corridors and talking to the people who worked there without anyone filtering what they said. She had learned to walk in those spaces without telegraphing discomfort, which had taken practice. The first time she went into a mechanical room on her own, she wore shoes that were wrong for the floor conditions and ruined them. She wore different shoes after that. He saw her in the building sometimes, passed her in a corridor, or found her talking to a facilities worker in a parking structure, or arrived at a site to find she had already been there and left notes in a pocket notebook she had started keep for exactly this purpose. They were always professional in those spaces. Correct. The kind of correct that comes from genuine mutual respect rather than the performance of it. The text message arrived on a Thursday evening. Would you treat them with kindness? He was at the kitchen table with the OIU quarterly report spread out in front of him, which was his current version of the inspection reports he had once spread out on the same table, looking for a fault he couldn't yet see. Claire was in her room with a paper due at midnight. The apartment smelled like the coffee she'd made 3 hours ago and left half finished on the counter. His phone lit up. He looked at it. Laura Mercer. Are you free Friday evening? Not for work. He picked the phone up, set it down, picked it up again. The thing about him was that he was thorough. He checked things. He verified. He did not proceed on assumptions when the actual data was available. He looked at the contact name, Laura Mercer. He looked at the number beneath it. Would you treat them with kindness? He scrolled back through the contact history, the original message, the ones that followed the thread that had started everything. He verified that this was the same number it had always been, that he was reading correctly, that his thumb was positioned correctly relative to the screen. He typed, "Did you send this to the right person?" The response came in less than a minute. I checked 3 times. Would you treat them with kindness? He sat at the kitchen table with the quarterly report spread out around him, and the sound of Claire's keyboard from the other room and the apartment quiet in its ordinary way. He typed, "Friday works." He set the phone face down on the table, looked at the quarterly report, found his place in it, kept working. A few minutes later, Claire came out for water, saw his face, and said without breaking stride toward the sink, "Good news?" "Possibly," he said. She filled her glass. Which kind? He thought about how to characterize it, about the specific kind of good news that arrived not as a windfall, but as the natural outcome of a long sequence of things done correctly and at considerable cost. The kind that doesn't feel like luck because it isn't luck. The kind that feels like something earned, paid for in full and then received. The kind you don't rush, he said. Claire considered this, drank her water, looked at him with the expression she had when she was deciding whether something required a response or simply an acknowledgement. She chose acknowledgement. Went back to her room. The keyboard resumed. He turned back to the quarterly report. Checked the section on the Lawrenceville heating system. Found the anomaly he'd flagged. Cross-referenced it against the invoice history. The same patience, the same thoroughness, the same attention to the gap between what the record said and what was actually true. He worked until the report was finished. Then he put it in order, set it on the corner of the table where he'd find it in the morning. turned off the kitchen light. In his room, he opened the nightstand drawer. At the back of it, behind the phone charger and the spare keys and the folded copy of the formal wage acknowledgement Laura had sent him in those first tight days, was the eviction notice. Soft at the folds. The paper of something that has been handled many times. He took it out, held it for a moment. He was not keeping it as evidence. The evidence had served its purpose and was filed in Donna's office, in a locked cabinet with a verification seal, and would remain there for as long as federal proceedings required. He was not keeping it as a reminder of hardship. A man who needs a piece of paper to remember what hardship feels like has been fortunate enough to forget, and Ryan Hale had not been that fortunate. He was keeping it because sometimes the thing that arrives to tell you the worst possible news about where you stand is the same thing that starts the chain of events that shows you where you could go. And those two facts, the threat and the beginning, existed in the same document, the same paper, the same Tuesday night delivery under a door. It seemed worth keeping. He put it carefully in the small box on the nightstand, the one he'd started for exactly this purpose, closed the lid. The box sat on the nightstand in the dark, small, ordinary, the kind of thing that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't know what was in it. He lay down. The building was doing what buildings do at 11:15 on a Thursday in December, settling into its own rhythms. The furnace cycling on. The pipes doing their specific work. Somewhere below him, in a building across the city, a controller unit was logging temperature reads and pressure differentials and system states with the patient accuracy of a machine that does not distinguish between important data and ordinary data, and so records all of it, because you record everything, because you never know which part will matter. He had spent 11 years understanding that. He intended to spend the next 11 the same way. He closed his eyes. Outside, Pittsburgh was doing its quiet late-night thing. The rivers where they had always been, the bridges holding, the cold that would be waiting for him in the morning, when he would start the truck and run through the sequence and get to work. He slept.